You've got it.
I've got
right.
it, yeah. First, a correction. The person who revealed this thing about the health bill was, of course, Alison Pollock, who the Edinburgh, because among us will know anyway, reveals the truth about most things. The point I'd like to make, and it rather contradicts what everyone's saying very optimistically about the internet, is firstly, you've got how many websites instead of the dozen or so papers. Now, very few of us are capable of reading a dozen or so papers every day. How many are going to read 100,000 relevant websites? But the continuing power of the press is surely proved most by this whole thing over News International. The Guardian, after all, has been going on about this, and as have a few other, I'd take obvious suspects like Private Eye, for the last 5-6 years. Most of the things that are coming out now aren't revelations, because they were just purely logical things you could draw from what we already knew. The only difference is that because, for reasons which I won't say, but you'll know, the rest of the press was keen to keep the whole issue under wraps and very much below the news agenda. And because they set that news agenda, and so the BBC and ITN and the other media, if they look at the press and say, well, only the Guardian is going on about this, this isn't something, therefore, which people are interested in. The whole thing has been kept under, to the great advantage of Mr. Murdoch and those working for him, for the last hasn't been expected to comment the panel might like to think going up, which is the legal restrictions on free speech and so on in Britain, which to a large extent can also impose both on the small people against the big people, but also on what actually gets said.
Now, Matthew, would you like to come back on that?
Just very briefly, I think what really tipped it with the phone hacking was the Millie Dowler revelation. I think before that, a lot of people were inclined to say, oh, well, these journalists and these politicians are all as bad as each other, and if journalists want to bug politicians, so much the better. Indeed, the Guardian itself exposed Jonathan Aitken many years ago by sending a false fax, a cod fax, to try and find out his hotel bills. And were we all very indignant about this? Yes, and I like that. But how much public indignation was there about that? How much public indignation was there when I forget which newspaper, installed a telephone bug into Antonia de Sancha's telephone when David Mellor was having an affair with her, and exposed David Mellor. I think it was David Mellor we all hated rather than the newspaper who bugged his telephone. Public moods change, and I think the public mood was, if not tolerant, it was fairly cynical of illicit press investigative practices until the Millie Dowler thing happened. And then people thought, aha, then I will just finish this. I think people then thought, aha, it's not just the politicians they're attacking, it's ordinary people in tragic circumstances. And I think that was a real tipping point, to use a cliche.
The point I was just going to make was, surely anyone who knows how newspapers work should have realised that if they're going to use these techniques against the people who are in the press because they're politicians or celebrities or whatever, if the people who are in the news are going to just happen to be there because they're relatives of someone who's tragically killed or whatever, they're going to use them against them as well. And how anyone could have been so publicly naive as to not take that up from the start, and how the police should have been so naive as to not look for that from the start. Well, you perhaps answer that.
Can I just say, as a journalist, the Millie Dowler revelation stunned me, because what we can't tell you, and what you ought to know, is that there are many times, and this is why there is a connection with the police, when the press will hold an embargo and they won't tell a story, maybe personal tragedies involving senior people, senior politicians and whatever, and the story won't break. There is an example that we probably all know on the panel, and I can't mention to you because of its nature. So you don't, I mean, a very small example is, and a relatively unimportant one compared to what I'm talking about, is when Prince Harry was in Afghanistan, and they held the line. The line is held because when our generation came into journalism, we actually did so with very good motives. And one of the first things I was taught by my first editor, and Mark the same, was keep your resignation letter in your back pocket. And if you're asked to do something that is against your ethical code, present it to your editor. That was the way we worked. And what has happened, or seems to have happened, I was trying to say earlier, I think there are two breeds of journalists in a sense. But that ethical code has to rely on the private soldier. It's the reporter on the ground. It's when an ambitious news editor or a nervous news editor, anxious to get the big story, asks you to go and knock on someone's door and ask a question that you would not like to receive yourself at a time like that. You don't do it. But I have myself said to a lovely young girl reporter, during the Dunblane tragedy, do you remember when the children were shot in their classrooms? On that day, I remember saying to her, if they ask you to go to the children's houses, don't do it, because if you do, in 10 years' time, you will be so blunted in your sensitivities, you won't be able to work, quite apart from the hurt you do today. She did it. They did ask her, and she did go to the doors. And she got very good interviews from parents. And she said to me afterwards, and this is also an experience shared by journalists, they expected, remember that poem, the Stop All the Clocks? They expected the world to pay attention. And the only way that happens is for some poor sod like us to go and make that initial action. Mark, my husband, I don't know if you want to talk about it. When the Lockerbie plane went on, you were expected to pick up your paper the next morning and read about it. The press were not given access to Lockerbie. But you tell them how you got in. Mark was one of the first people into Lockerbie.
Things that, I suppose, at events like Lockerbie, you aren't reading anyone's privacy. And so it's a huge, there are huge stories where it's very hard to get in simply because there's a disaster and all the normal forms of travel, transport, communication go down, and that was what I'm not. But you, I think the point there is a slightly different one, because there's no ambiguity about your role. You obviously have to be sensitive, but I think that everyone knows that some stories are so big and so public that they have to be covered. But going back to the question, there are journalists, many journalists, who want the news of the world, the people who've done these deeds of the news of the world, to be found out and to be tried if what they've done is criminal, simply because there are still an awful lot of journalists who do keep their resignation letter in their back pocket. And there are an awful lot of journalists in really quite a lot of papers who simply wouldn't do what News of the World journalists were asked to do. And if they were asked to do it and refused, would be perfectly happy. Well, not happy, but they would accept the consequence of that. Maybe they lost their job. There are a lot of people, in politics too, there are a lot of people in politics and in journalism who do work by principle. I think one of the sadnesses of both the MP's expenses story and also this man News of the World story is that it does sort of confirm, or seem to confirm, the general view that politics and journalism is rotten. And actually it's not rotten. There are strong areas within both classes, and it's a pity that they're both being brought down at this time.
Yeah, MP's expenses, to just interject for one sentence here, don't forget, because I think these things are more shaded than sometimes appears, don't forget that the whole MP's expenses scandal rested originally on a stolen CD, which was sold by the person who stole it to the Daily Telegraph, who then kicked off the whole story. Are we sorry that he sold it? Are we sorry that the Daily Telegraph bought it? It was offered to the Times, incidentally. And the Times turned it down on principle that we didn't buy stolen information, so it was offered to the Daily Telegraph. Where do you stand on that? If you're like me, you're not quite sure. These things are not easy.
Just one last comment on this, and then we'll take the next question.
It was actually in the second part of your question, which was about freedom of expression. Because the question is, and I find this very, very complicated indeed, is does freedom of expression go along with, the right to freedom of expression go along with the right to private life, a right to privacy? And I think that what happened yesterday and this morning with Gordon Brown's son is a very, very interesting and complicated example of this. The father of a child with cystic fibrosis discovers that Gordon Brown's son has been born with cystic fibrosis. He said on the news this morning, I waited and waited and waited for this powerful man to speak out on this subject, which would have helped all sufferers of cystic fibrosis. And when he didn't, I decided to go to the press. He has framed this man, who is still, as far as I know, anonymous. So he has maintained his own right to privacy, has decided that Gordon Brown is not, and his child are not private citizens and do not have the right for privacy because he is the Prime Minister and because he's powerful. And I find that really, really creepy.